Welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. This episode is brought to you by Audible.com, and we've news on a great news series from them on the US presidents coming up a bit later in the show. Now, if you're new to us, you may not know that we produce a number of other history-related podcasts as well. Angus, the other half at the History Network here, does his own podcast dedicated to World War II. Angus continues to produce 2 episodes monthly, and it's an eclectic mix of Second World War-related topics. MacArthur was a notable episode, and his recent episode on the PBY Catalina flying boat is proving a popular one too, where Angus actually talks to a guy who owns a share in one and flies it. We also produce the podcast for Ancient Warfare magazine, so if ancient warfare is your thing, then why not have a listen along to that? And if wargaming is your thing, then we produce the Wargaming Soldiers and Strategy podcast, and in the latest episode, out Monday 3rd of October, the guys are looking at all things terrain. So you've plenty to keep your ears busy there, and all you need to do is head to www.thehistorynetwork.org and use the links there to access all these great podcasts. Incidentally, we've a nice big shiny donate button on the homepage at the site, and if you feel the urge, we would certainly welcome that most gratefully. Or if you want a bit more listening bang for your buck, then in the store at the website you can find our past seasons all packaged up as chaptered files for download. These seasons vary from between around 2.5 hours to over 5 hours, and they are just £2 each. Thanks for your continued support. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 21, Episode 10, The Battle of Hattin. In 1187, Saladin, at the head of a huge army, crossed the river Jordan, laying siege to the fortress at Tiberias. Inside was the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. Until recently, Raymond had been at odds with the new Crusader king, Guy of Lusignan. The Crusader army numbered an impressive 20,000, though this was not as large as Saladin's. What it lacked in quantity, however, it made up for in quality, with heavily armoured knights, horsemen, foot soldiers and crossbowmen. When word reached Guy that the siege was underway, he decided to relieve the fortress with all haste, taking the shortest route possible straight across the hot, arid plains with minimal baggage. The Crusaders had taken Saladin's bait. The Christian nobles of the Crusader kingdoms at this time were divided. Their grip of the region was never strong. Their power relied upon strong fortresses they could fall back upon. In 1174, Baldwin IV, the leper king, ascended to the throne of Jerusalem aged just 13. Not expected to live long initially, Miles of Plancy acted as self-declared regent. Not a native of the East, he was headstrong, refusing to consult with the powerful families who had been established for generations. Raymond III of Tripoli was Baldwin's closest relative. Being the king's cousin, he demanded to be made regent. His family had taken part in the First Crusade. He was the 3rd generation to live in the East. The other long-established barons favoured Raymond. When Miles was assassinated in Acre, the problem of who was to act as the young king's regent was solved. This illustrates how fractious the kingdoms were. Nobles vied for power which was ephemeral, as they lived in an occupied land where they struggled to find peace with their Muslim neighbours. The older families understood this, but to maintain Christian numbers, new recruits were constantly encouraged from Europe. Full of religious zeal and keen to make their names, these new Crusaders were much less willing to live peacefully with the infidels that they had come to fight. Guy of Lusignan was banished from his homeland Poitou, then part of the Duchy of Aquitaine. He made his way to the Holy Land. His older brother was already there, himself fleeing after a failed rebellion. He'd married well in Jerusalem, allowing him access to the royal court. When his younger brother arrived, he introduced him to Baldwin IV's sister, Sibylla. She had been married once before, but her husband had died. Her connection to the King of Jerusalem made her a rich prize for ambitious nobles. She was caught in the power play as various factions favoured who she would wed. With her brother unlikely to live long, any husband would have a strong claim to the throne. The number one contender of the old Crusader families was Baldwin of Ibelin. However, a foreign match was essential to the kingdom, bringing the possibility of external military aid. Baldwin IV himself arranged the marriage to Guy. With the new French King Philip II a minor, Guy's status as a vassal of the king and Sibyilla's first cousin Henry II of England, who owed the Pope a potential pilgrimage, was useful in terms of offering a source of external help. They married in haste in 1180, before Raymond of Tripoli could impose a husband on her. As this Game of Thrones was being played out, another power had been rising in the east, that of Saladin. Born in Tikrit, in what is now modern-day Iraq, he entered military service young, serving under his uncle, who provided an excellent education, aided by Saladin's keenness for study. In 1168 he was sent to Egypt, where a power struggle had broken out between the Egyptian ruler and the Crusader king of Jerusalem. Though still young, he was appointed vizier. Perhaps with his youth he was presumed to be non-threatening, though his military record was known and had been cemented through fighting with his uncle. Whatever the reason, the rival Muslim leaders seemed to accept him. In 1171, Saladin deposed the same Egyptian caliph, ending the Shiite dynasty which had ruled from the 10th century. With a secure power base, he now began his own work of conquest of Syria and then Palestine. Doing so brought him into direct conflict with the Crusader kingdoms. His initial skirmishes proved to him the quality of the heavily armed knight. At Montesgard, some 300-400 knights surprised his much larger force of perhaps over 20,000 and routed them. Fighting continued on and off with the Christian kingdoms. All the while he continued to expand his rule to many places, now still familiar to us, places such as Aleppo and Mosul. Saladin's attention was once more focused on the Crusader kingdoms in 1182, when Raymond of Tripoli began harassing Muslim caravans along trading routes on the Red Sea. In response, Saladin twice laid siege to the impressive and very substantial fortress at Karak. At one point, 9 catapults bombarded the walls, yet the Crusader knights inside held out until a relief force arrived, causing Saladin to withdraw. A lull in hostilities now occurred until in 1186-87, when Raynald attacked a large caravan en route to Syria. He took all the merchants, their families and riches, and then refused to see envoys from Saladin conveying his demands for compensation. Saladin now turned to Guy of Lusignan, who now ruled in Jerusalem, but Raynald refused to obey the king, stating he was lord of this land, just as Guy was lord of his, and he had no truces with the Saracens. At around the same time, Saladin's son had been granted by Raymond of Tripoli passage through his lands. The Knights Templar had been informed, but chose to ignore the agreement, and with 100 knights they rode out to confront the Saracens. Belief in their own fighting prowess and that God was on their side, they attacked over 5,000 Saracen warriors. The result was unsurprising. Surrounded by overwhelming numbers, they were cut to pieces, their heads paraded on lances, only 4 escaped. At the head of 30,000 men, the largest army Saladin had yet commanded, he laid siege to the city of Tiberias, where Raymond of Tripoli's wife was residing. Raymond was now forced to side with Guy of Lusignan, who until now he hadn't supported as king of Jerusalem. They gathered their forces at Acre. Though his wife was still in Tiberias, Raymond didn't support a direct march to the city. He knew if the city fell, Saladin would conform to Saracen honour and not hurt a woman of her rank. By marching directly to the beleaguered city, they would be moving away from their power base and over hot, arid plains. He was keenly aware of the lack of water when they moved into the country, but why should Guy take Raymond's counsel? He hadn't supported his claim to the throne. The master of the Knights Templar, recently so ignominiously defeated, pressed for direct action, to march straight across the desert. Were the Christian knights not superior? The distance was only short, 20 miles on modern roads. Guy decided to cross the plain with all haste. A large baggage train, including water carts pulled by oxen, would only slow them down, so it was left behind. If they could cross fast enough, water would not be a problem. An assumption perhaps based on how fast mounted knights could travel in a few hours. Little account seemed to be taken of the foot soldiers who would need several days to cross that distance, slowing the horsemen down. But to encourage the men, Guy called for the Bishop of Acre to carry the true cross as the army's standard. It was a move that fitted perfectly with Saladin's plan. He needed the Crusader army away from any fortress it could fall back upon. The march over the plains would allow his men to harry the army. He could then pick his time and place of attack. Before we get to the battle itself, let me just tell you about Audible's latest series on the US presidents. Perhaps you think today's politicians are weird. Well, did you know that Theodore Roosevelt stuffed dead animals in his spare time? You can get more useful, or possibly useless facts about the weirdos who have run the USA on Presidents Are People Too, the very latest episodes of which are available right now in the Audible app. And you can find out how to listen at audible.com/presidents. That's audible.com/presidents. Thank you. It was early in the morning when the Crusader army moved out. All the men that could be spared had answered the call. They totalled around 20,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 knights. When the time came, they would be outnumbered by the Saracens. Saladin had perhaps 18,000 infantry and, crucially, 12,000 cavalry. The leading column of the army was commanded by Raymond of Tripoli, his best fighting men out front, with platoons of crossbowmen on the wings. Beyond that, a screen well out on the flanks to prevent any attempt on the true cross. Behind them, marching discipline was somewhat more lax as foot soldiers mingled with mounted knights. As the morning wore on, the army began to stretch out. When a halt was called to give the trailing men a chance to catch up, they only got more disorganised as units piled into one another. Saladin dispatched his light cavalry to harass the Crusader army at any opportunity. Archers would fire volleys at the marching men. But the Saracens made no concerted attack. These attacks were of little consequence to the armoured knights. But what was becoming a problem was the sun. The heat was intense, and soon their water bottles were empty. Guy was determined upon his course. By noon they had covered 6 miles. They could have watered at some nearby springs, but Guy was keen to press the last 9 miles. Moving beyond the springs, Saladin now moved troops round to the rear of the Crusader army, cutting them off from the nearest water source if they chose to fall back. The advance became halting as Saracen skirmishing increased. The long procession began to fall apart, some elements forced to stop to fend off attack. In front, Raymond sensed that to continue along the planned route directly to Tiberias would be risky, and suggested they divert to the northeast and spend the night at the Horns of Hattin, a rocky hill with 2 peaks. They could refill their water bottles at the spring and move on to Tiberias the following day. They needed to cover just 6 miles. The move had been anticipated by Saladin, who had his men gather brushwood and anything else that could be used to light a fire, and was used to fence in the army. The smoke on top of the heat and constant attacks broke some knights who attempted to defect, urging Saladin to attack, stating, "They cannot do anything for themselves, they are all already dead." When a Saracen host blocked their way, Raymond of Tripoli, leading the vanguard, charged them. He was fully aware they needed to break through to reach the springs. Though inferior in number, these heavily armoured men fought with determination, opening a gap in the Saracen line, which then broke. Raymond urged Guy to move the Crusader force through with all haste, but a messenger arrived informing Raymond that he was ordered to halt and make camp. Guy was unwilling to risk the true cross and wanted to gather his men, who were now scattered. Throughout the night, Saladin's army made preparations and tightened the noose. Water was brought up for them, along with 400 camel-loads of arrows. The next morning, the demoralised Crusader army broke camp. Many hadn't had any water for nearly 24 hours. In the early morning light, a young Saracen drew close to their lines with a message from Saladin. The Sultan offered a safe passage, provided they agree to quit the lands, relinquishing all title, returning over the seas to whence they came. Seeking counsel, both the Master of the Templar and Raymond de Chatillon were of the opinion that no such agreement would be acceptable. Raymond of Tripoli was not present. Perhaps things might have been different with his counsel. On the face of it, their position might not have been considered too bad. They were atop of a rise, and Saladin's forces, though greater in number, were not overwhelming. But the key factor was thirst. The men were desperate for water. The better part of the infantry was now nothing more than a rabble. Unit cohesion had disintegrated. When met, they found themselves blocked by strong Saracen formations, and men fled en masse, desperate to attempt to get away. They were cut down. Saladin's cavalry charged into Raymond's vanguard. Retaining their discipline, foot soldiers stuck their lances into the earth, and the initial charge was broken. They now came on foot. The wall of heavily armed knights were invulnerable to the arrows. Saracen infantry attacks were halted, then driven back. The Saracens fed in more troops, yet the knights continued to resist. But with so many men-at-arms gone, the sheer weight of numbers were against the remaining Crusader force. The king decided to halt. Any further attempt to move his remaining knights would lead to them being further whittled away. In a desperate attempt to protect the true cross, he had his tent pitched and the relic placed inside. Raymond of Tripoli gathered his final remaining men, and in a desperate charge pierced the Saracen line, punching through. Once through, the Saracen line snapped shut. Now there was little he could do to affect the outcome of the battle, so he decided to press on toward Tyre. A few dismounted knights were left to protect the true cross. Surrounded by thousands of Saracens, they twice charged. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir recorded the final moments of the battle. When the king of the Franks was on the hill with that band, they made a formidable charge against the Muslims facing them, so that they drove them back to my father. I looked towards him, and he was overcome by grief, and his complexion pale. He took hold of his beard and advanced, crying out, "Give the lie to the devil." The Muslims rallied, returned to the fight, and climbed the hill. When I saw that the Franks withdrew, pursued by the Muslims, I shouted for joy. "We have beaten them!" But the Franks rallied and charged again like the first time, and drove the Muslims back to my father. He acted as he had done on the first occasion, and the Muslims turned upon the Franks and drove them back to the hill.
I again shouted, "We have beaten them," but my father rounded on me and said, "Be quiet, we have not beaten them until that tent falls." As he was speaking to me, the tent fell. The Sultan dismounted, prostrated himself in thanks to God Almighty, and wept for joy. The guardian of the True Cross, the Bishop of Acre, was slain and the relics seized. Guy of Lusignan, along with Raymond de Tripoli, was captured. Brought before Saladin, Guy was offered a cup of fruit water chilled with snow. When he passed the cup to Raynald, who was in his 60s, Saladin allowed him to drink and then declared he would not drink again. He had not been offered the cup by Saladin himself and was accused of oath-breaking by making the initial attack. Once Raynald put down the cup, he was led out of the tent, whereupon Saladin, with one stroke, beheaded him. The loss at Hattin was disastrous for the Crusaders. The fortress at Tiberias surrendered. Guy, the king of Jerusalem, was a prisoner. In fielding such a large army, the garrisons of other fortresses had critically been depleted. In months, Crusader stronghold after stronghold fell to the Saracen whirlwind. Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, and in October, Jerusalem surrendered. Ultimately, Guy's logistical oversight to supply his men with water resulted in Jerusalem being lost, and further crusades to recapture it would not succeed. So don't hang up your headphones just yet, even though this is episode 10 of season 21, because we have an episode 11 of season 21 coming up in a couple of weeks. So watch out for that one then.
Would you like to write a script for us? Many of our most popular episodes have been written by listeners. So why not drop us a line with an idea for your script? info@thehistorynetwork.org. And it's the same address if you just want to suggest a topic for us to cover sometime in the future. Do go along to the website www.thehistorynetwork.org, where you'll find all the information about those other podcasts we produce, which I told you about at the beginning of the show. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast,
written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.